Hey guys, so I am here for a June TBR as well as a little wrap-up of the reading I have done in the last week. This June TBR will actually be a bona fide TBR because several of these books will be buddy reads, so I'm contractually obligated to read them, so I will absolutely be reading them. And the rest are books that I'm actually currently working on. So to start with the books that book that I read this week, I mentioned I made a whole video about my reading slump last Saturday. And I mentioned that I was starting to read the first book in the Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer. And I was liking it, but I woke up the morning after making that video realizing that it wasn't quite what I think I needed, because the world that Ada Palmer creates in the Terra Ignota series is very alien and weird and complicated, and there are a lot of things to wrap your head around, because it's so strange. And so there's just a lot of acclimating to that world that you have to do in order to grasp the story. And then on top of that, the plot is also very complex, with a lot of scheming politicians and all sorts of things. And so I just realized it wasn't quite what I needed. What I think I needed, and what turned out to be true, was I needed either something very light or something familiar. And so I went with familiar, which obviously entails rereads. So I decided to reread Children of Dune by Frank Herbert, the third book in his Dune saga. I did reread the second book in the Dune saga earlier this year, and I reread Dune at the end of last year, so yeah, I am all set to continue with the Dune saga now, which I wasn't entirely certain I was going to do, because I wasn't sure how good it was, but I have heard that God Emperor of Dune, the fourth book, is excellent. And to talk a bit about Children of Dune, it is great. The first thing I wanted to say about Children of Dune is that it is everything that Dune Messiah, the second book in the series, was not. Dune Messiah was plodding and wordy and boring, and it shoved a lot of philosophical ideas down your throat without really earning them. Children of Dune did not do that. It is gripping, and those philosophical ideas are woven into the story, and there's this complex web of plots going on by a few different characters in Children of Dune that you're always just on the cusp of understanding, but not quite understanding. Well, who's smarter than whom, and who, you know, has the upper hand in a certain situation, who's plotting what. And it's not all fully unwoven until like the last 50 pages. So you're really gripped the whole time. So it was just great. It was awesome. And it again has solidified my desire to move on with the Dune saga onto God Emperor of Dune. So I really enjoyed it, and it was just what I needed to return to a fantastical world like this. And it is one of the most incredible feats of world building ever that Frank Herbert achieved in this saga. Because again, like the Ada Palmer books, it is a very alien, strange world that you're introduced to in the Dune saga. And that's what makes the first book, Dune, kind of hard for some people to get into, because it's such a weird world. But, you know, I have read Dune twice now. I've seen both adaptations of Dune. So I know this world, so it was like coming home for me, and it was just wonderful. It was just what I needed, and I'm back to being enthusiastic about books. So before I get into the books that I'm going to be reading, I want to talk about a couple of books that I'm currently working on. And the first of those is The Legend of Colton H. Bryant by Alexandra Fuller. And this is a nonfiction account of the life of Colton H. Bryant, who was a man who was born and raised in Wyoming. And lived a very ordinary life. He had ADHD and was in special ed for much of elementary school. Also was had kind of a sort of zany, erratic personality, but was really a really nice guy and fun to be around. And what sort of captured Alexandra Fuller's attention with his story, though, was that he died at the age of 25 of an accident at an oil rig that he was working at. And his death could have easily been prevented if there had been stairs on the oil rig where he was working, and there weren't. And so the sort of subtext of this book is a critique of the oil industry and how they do so much to make costs as low as possible and to maximize profit. And obviously making costs low, part of that is making worker safety almost non-existent. So actually death on oil rigs is a very common occurrence in places in Wyoming and areas around it. And so that's kind of the subtext of this book, and that obviously is how the book ends, since it is the account of his life. It is a biography, really, but she sort of adds like dialogue. So she creates dialogue along the way, and there are scenes that maybe happened, maybe didn't, but it's all based on close interviews with Colton, Bryant's friends and family. So it's all like, all is, there's nothing in here that didn't happen. It's all part of his life. This is a work of nonfiction. But really it is just a portrait of this guy, of this really nice guy. He sounds like it was a lot of fun to be around. He just loved everything sort of redneck Wyoming-y. He loved to go fishing, go hunting, ride in a pickup truck, ride horses, cowboying, all that stuff. And so it really is just a portrait of him and his friends, who are very similar to him in the sense of being very sort of redneck or hillbilly-like. And also a portrait of Wyoming in the late 20th century, I think, in ways that are both poetic and beautiful, but also troubling, again, because, again, there is that subtext of these oil rigs and also the rampant substance abuse, sexual abuse, and mental illness that occurs in Wyoming and other states like it out west. So yeah, I'm really liking it. And what I'm most impressed by in it, actually, is that Alexandra Fuller is originally from England. She was born in England and then raised for much of her childhood in Zimbabwe. So she's not American. She wasn't born and raised in America. And yet she's achieved a narrative voice in this book that sounds really American. Like I honestly, it's hard for me to believe that this wasn't written by an American, especially an American from out west. It sounds like it's written by someone from Wyoming. So I'm very impressed with that. And the last book that I am currently reading is sort of going against the whole mantra last week of read things that are light and easy. It's The War for Gaul by Julius Caesar, a new translation by James O'Donnell. So this translation was just published this year. And yeah, so this is Julius Caesar's own sort of memoir about his conquest of Gaul, which is the area we now know as France. It's basically propaganda. It's basically Julius Caesar writing his own hagiography about himself, because it's always Julius Caesar with this force that is super outnumbered, and the barbarians always somehow are in the wrong, even though Julius Caesar is the conqueror, and all that good stuff that conquerors love to say. I was interested in this because I saw a review of it by Steve Donahue at Open Letters, and it sounded like a really good, approachable translation, and it really is. Julius Caesar actually wrote this book in a very easy to read, approachable Latin, because he wanted it to sell, essentially. He wrote it as these events were happening, and essentially sending it back to Rome to get published. And it was a bestseller when it was published. And so that really holds up in this translation. It is actually very easy to read for a work of history. And yeah, I'm finding it really interesting. I mean, the subtext is very interesting. Sort of, like I said, how Julius Caesar always tries to make the barbarians out to be the sort of aggressors somehow, even though obviously he is the invader. I find that interesting, and I see a lot of parallels sort of with how the United States dealt with Native Americans in its history, because the United States always somehow managed to convince itself that Native Americans were this like savage race of lesser beings who were being super violent towards white people, and they needed to be like civilized, and part of that was subjugating them violently and all these nasty things. And I see a similar subtext to Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Yeah, I'm enjoying that, actually, and I'm taking it very slowly. I'm gonna take the whole month to read this book. I'm just reading one section per week, just like 10 pages, 10-15 pages a day, nothing much. But yeah, so I'm liking it, and I'm taking notes as well, so that's kind of fun. And anyway, so that is what I have read this week. And now on to my TBR for this month. So to start off with my buddy reads, the first is Faust, parts 1 and 2 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This will be my second time reading it. I just read it. I just read part 2 at the beginning of this year and part 1 at the end of last year, and it's rare that I reread a book in such short order, but Faust is such a weird book. yeah, it's like, and I've read the introduction to this edition, and the author in that talks about kind of how this book is kind of unclassifiable. You know, it's ostensibly a play, but, you know, there are aspects in it of an epic, of lyric poetry. There are parts of it that really have no actual plot. They're just kind of there to have people talk about stuff and recite beautiful poetry. And there's also the problem of the fact that narratively it doesn't entirely hold together, especially part 2. In part 2, the 5 acts that make it up don't necessarily logically connect with each other. They're more sort of metaphorically connected, and so it's just a lot to wrap your head around on a first reading, and there's a lot of sort of complex subtext to it that you really sort of need a commentary to get, and I had that commentary while I read part 2 the first time, but what I'm looking forward to this time is just sort of knowing the deal with Faust, knowing that it's a weird book, and sort of having an idea of what Goethe is getting at, and just trying to enjoy it more, just to read it and let it wash over me in the way books should be able to, and to see what connections I make and how I enjoy it this time. And that's a buddy read with Elena Macredina, Crystal of Biblioatlas, and Sharon Goforth, who I think is a commenter. I'm not sure if she has a channel or whether she has a comment username, but anyway, she's another person who's joining us. So yeah, there's that. The next buddy read I will be partaking in is Emma by Jane Austen. I did try to join in Steve Donahue's mandatory buddy read of Pride and Prejudice earlier this year, but and I got like 10% of the way through Pride and Prejudice and didn't end up finishing it. It just kind of got subsumed by other books that I was a bit more interested in at the time. And I really think that going into Jane Austen at a place that's not Pride and Prejudice will be good for me, because first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I really didn't like it. And so I was a bit trepidatious about going back into Pride and Prejudice. So I think going into Emma instead will allow me to hopefully enjoy reading Jane Austen without that sort of baggage. And then eventually I will come back to rereading Pride and Prejudice and hopefully just be able to enjoy it for what it is, and disabuse it from my adolescent hatred of it. So yeah, I'll be reading that with Britta Bowler, if I didn't already say that, and we're doing that in the second week of June, so yeah. Anyway, looking forward to that. And then my last buddy read is with Mark of Words Everywhere, and we're doing that in the third week of June, and it is All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. He's a polarizing author who needs little introduction, but we're going to be buddy reading this. I think it's going to be my third Cormac McCarthy. I think it's going to be Mark's second. And yeah, I think we're both really looking forward to it. I'm definitely looking forward to it. I have heard very good things about this novel. And I also just, I kind of want to read everything by Cormac McCarthy. And then the last book on my TBR is not really a buddy read, but it's a part of Jason of Chapter and Verse's course on death and mortality in literature and film. And so the book for this month is Body of Work, Meditations on Mortality from the Human Anatomy Lab by Christine Montross. And I just thought that this book sounded really interesting. It, you know, it's right there in the subtitle. It's about death and dying from an anatomy lab, which sounds really interesting. And I'm just excited to get more involved in Jason's course that he's doing, because I have really liked the videos of it that I've watched so far, but have been sort of not, I've been inconsistent with actually participating. So I'm looking forward to reading this. And so yeah, that's my wrap up for this week and my TBR. Let me know if you guys have any thoughts, if you've read these books or not. And yeah, I hope you're all having a good weekend and a good Sunday, and I hope you have a nice week. And I will see you Friday probably. So anyway, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.